This is Mr. Lilly with a lecture for lesson 15. Let me open the PowerPoint. Um, this is lesson 15 is the Civil War. We talked about the 1850s and the 1860 election when Lincoln was elected. Even before he was inaugurated, because he was opposed to the expansion of slavery and had spoken against existing slavery, and because the Republican Party was opposed to, at least in some measure, opposed to slavery, states in the South decided they would no longer stay in the Union. In December of 1860, the South Carolina legislature voted to secede. In January, still before Lincoln's inauguration, five more states, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, and Louisiana states, the Deep South, they also secede. And then in February of 1861, Texas secedes. Governor Sam Houston opposed secession. And when Texas seceded, he refused to take an oath to the Confederacy. It ended his political career, and he died in 1863, kind of an outcast because he did not support the Confederacy. Now, there were some states that didn't secede at that point. As you can see on the map, down at the bottom right-hand corner, these are states further south. You still have states on the border that don't secede initially. But also in these states that seceded, that left the country, there was federal property. Forts, the seceded states took over property in Pensacola, Florida, and near Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. Now, Fort Sumter we'll talk about in a few minutes. President Buchanan, during most of his presidency, he didn't have much of a backbone, but he refused to yield Fort Sumter when South Carolina demanded it. But he he had some backbone, but not enough, because the federal government tried to send supplies to Fort Sumter, and Buchanan did nothing when South Carolina turned back a supply ship. After these states seceded, there was a senator in Kentucky, a border state. He proposed a compromise. He proposed extending the Missouri Compromise line to the Pacific in order to avert these states leaving the country and to avert war. This wasn't accepted, though. Fort Sumter, as we talked about, Lincoln was inaugurated in March of 1861, so Buchanan's no longer the president. Lincoln announced he would send supplies to Fort Sumter. As you can see, Fort Sumter is in the middle of the bay near Charleston, so it needs to be resupplied. It hadn't been resupplied for at least several weeks. Lincoln announced he would resupply Fort Sumter, and then Confederate troops they attacked Fort Sumter for 2 days. And in April 12, 1861, a Union major, Robert Anderson, who was from Kentucky, a border state, surrendered to the Confederates. You had bombardments, but you didn't really have casualties. You didn't have soldiers killed in this battle. After Fort Sumter, because the Confederate states or the states that had left, they attacked a Union installation. Lincoln called for troops, and after that, in April and May of 1861, 4 border states, Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina, or states closer to the north, they seceded. Now, you can see here, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware were also slave states, but they don't end up seceding. They had people in the states fight on both sides, but the states themselves don't secede. And the war's going to start. The North has some significant advantages. They have more industry, they have more railroads, they have more telegraphs. And actually, telegraphs and railroads follow the same line. And their strengths, although they are weaknesses in some areas because they only go where the lines are built. The North had better financial structure. The Southern advantages, most of the war was fought in the South. They already had trained officers. The white population was united, um, nearly united. There were some exceptions. West Virginia, the northwestern part of Virginia, um, German immigrants in Texas. Other parts of Appalachia in the South wouldn't support the war efforts as much. Also, parts of Tennessee would not support the war effort or support the Confederacy as much as other areas. Northern disadvantages, as we mentioned, even though they have railroads and telegraphs, are limited as to where they could go. The population in the North is not as united as the white population was in the South. The North is fighting on enemy territory. The Southern disadvantages, they don't have as many railroads. Their financial system is based on agriculture. It's not as sophisticated as that of the North. And a large part of the population, there are 4 million African Americans, most of whom are slaves, would not support the war. Both nations use what we'll call economic nationalism. After secession, the Republican Party, which is still a relatively young party, has only been around for less than a decade, but they passed several laws that had been opposed by Southern Democrats. In 1862, the Homestead Act was passed, where settlers in the West could obtain 160 acres after living on the land and improving it. By that, it's meant chopping down trees, clearing land, building a cabin or a house, and so settlers could gain 160 acres for a small fee. The Morrill Act, the land grant statute, which transferred public land to states, used for land grant colleges. A lot of the universities in the United States come from this act. Also, they began to build railroads. There had been a controversy and disagreement about where the railroad should be built when the South secedes. The Union Pacific, the remaining states decide to build the railroad through Omaha further north. The Union Pacific would build west from Omaha. The Central Pacific would build east from California. Also, some banking acts incorporated new banks. Finances in the North, wars are very costly. You have taxes on income. The first time there's an income tax and a sales tax on goods. Paper currency is issued that's not backed by any precious metal. This did lead to some inflation and the devaluation of currency. Also, the North, the Union, would sell war bonds and also take out loans. At the beginning of the war, the North has 16,000 troops. Now, the United States had more troops, but some of them are now loyal to the Confederacy. Lincoln calls for 23,000 more initially. Neither of those are going to be sufficient. And in July of 1861, Congress allows for 500,000 volunteers for 3-year terms. That doesn't get enough people. And in March of 1863, there's a law for the draft. In other words, you're going to be forced into the war. However, there was an exception. Someone who's drafted could pay someone else $300 to substitute. That wasn't always popular. There was opposition to the draft in the North. There were still Democrats, many of whom were opposed to the war. They called themselves peace Democrats. Opponents would call them Copperheads, were opposed to the war and to the draft. Also in New York City in 1863, there were draft riots. Now, there had been Irish immigrants serving in the military, but when the draft was instituted, some people in New York thought it was applied unfairly, and so there was a large riot, a long riot that lasted 4 days. 100 people were killed, perhaps more. It's one of the worst riots in American history. But its opposition, not all Irish immigrants, but some Irish immigrants opposed the way the draft was being applied to them. Troops from Gettysburg, which was the Battle of Gettysburg, took place near the same time, had to come and help stop the rioting. Lincoln, we think Lincoln is a presidential icon, but he did some actions in the Civil War that are somewhat questionable. He sent troops without asking for congressional authorization. He had military arrests of civilians. He suspended habeas corpus. Habeas corpus is a legal maneuver used when someone is arrested or taken into custody. if they're not charged with a crime. If you suspend habeas corpus, then that allowed the Union, the North, to keep people imprisoned without actually charging them for a crime, without actually having a trial. Also, Lincoln declared that all those who were discouraging enlistments or who were disloyal were subject to arrest, and there were some arrests. Clement Van Landingham of Ohio, who had been a member of the House of Representatives, he ran for governor of Ohio. He was arrested and imprisoned and then later exiled for publicly criticizing the war. So there's some things that went on that we wouldn't think would be appropriate. Out of the Civil War, he didn't actually make that much money doing it, but Matthew Brady and photographers that he supervised, they published pictures designed to help the war effort. And his photographs would often be used for propaganda. You can see some of them show the dead on the battlefield, troops in action, but he also had some. This is Ulysses S. Grant. This was a Matthew Brady, either Matthew Brady or a photographer under his supervision took those. In 1864, Lincoln ran for re-election. Hannibal Hamlin had been his first vice president. He changes that for Andrew Johnson of Tennessee, who was a Southerner but loyal to the North. They ran on, even though it was still the Republican Party, they called it the National Union Party. Lincoln faced George McClellan, a former general, and Lincoln won pretty handily. Certainly in the Electoral College, it was a landslide, a little bit closer in the popular vote, but he won fairly comfortably. Also, when the Civil War started, Lincoln is reported to have said that he would, if he could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, he would, or if he could save the Union by keeping them enslaved, he would. But that was the ultimate issue that started the Civil War, and I think Lincoln came to realize that the Civil War needed to be about emancipation. Representative Thaddeus Stevens and Senator Charles Sumner, who became known as radical Republicans, they wanted to abolish slavery immediately. And there were some acts that declared slaves of those who opposed the Union to be freed. So if Union soldiers captured an area, slaves that were in those areas were declared to be free. And then at the beginning of 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing some slaves, but really only those in territories still opposing the Union. Places like Kentucky and Maryland, slaves weren't freed by the Emancipation Proclamation, but it did make the Civil War officially over the issue of slavery. And there were slaves that were fleeing north or to Union troops. And there were African Americans that fought in the Civil War. They would always serve under white officers. Things were worse for them. They would die of disease more often than white soldiers. And if they were captured, they may just be killed rather than taken prisoner or returned to former masters. The Confederacy, it's a new country. It has a constitution similar to the United States, but it specifically states that states were sovereign. In other words, because the Confederacy is alleging that the states in it were sovereign and could leave the United States, so they enshrine that in their constitution. Jefferson Davis of Mississippi was a moderate, and like Lincoln, both were born in Kentucky. Lincoln's family moved to Indiana and then Illinois. Jefferson Davis' family moved further south. Vice President Alexander Stephens of Georgia, initially he had opposed secession, but went into the Confederacy with his state. So the Confederacy picked two people in its presidency that were not, that were more moderate. The Confederacy also needed to support its troops. They called it a food draft. Confederate soldiers could seize food from farms. Now, obviously, the residents of those farms didn't like that. The government also seized what railroads there were. They seized any shipping. And slaves were forced to work on military projects. The Confederacy had a harder time financing the war. They tried to get funds from individual states, kind of like originally the United States had done under the Articles of Confederation. That didn't work any better this time. In 1863, the Confederacy imposed an income tax. They also issued bonds. In other words, they borrow money from citizens who buy a bond that's supposed to be worth more in, say, 4 or 5 years, but those bonds became almost worthless. They tried to borrow money from Europe without much success, using cotton as a collateral because particularly Great Britain depended a lot on Southern cotton. They also issued paper money, and they had horrible inflation in the South. The North had pretty bad inflation, but the South had runaway inflation. The Conscription Act, in other words, the Draft Act of 1862 held that all white males between 18 and 35 had to serve in the military for 3 years. The South instituted the draft before the North. Also, as in the North, wealthy citizens could pay for a substitute, but there was objections to that, and that was repealed in 1863. At the end of 1862, there were 500,000 soldiers fighting for the Confederacy. But despite that, there was later a shortage of soldiers, and towards the end of the war, the South passed a law allowing for slaves to be drafted, but the war ended before that could occur. The Union had the Navy because the South seceded. The North has the Navy, and they blockade the South, and some vessels were able to slip through. And then in March of 1862, the South fitted a ship with iron known as the Merrimac of Virginia. And it had success until it fought the Monitor, a northern ship, and that was a draw, but that really stopped the power of that ship. There were new states instituted during the Civil War. Kansas, remember in the 1850s, there had been an issue whether Kansas would be a free or a slave state. It came in to the Union in 1861 as a free state. Also, when Virginia seceded from the Union, there were many in northwestern Virginia who traditionally had a lot of problems with the capital in Richmond. They felt they were overlooked, but they decided to form a new government. They formed a reorganized government of Virginia, and said, we're the legitimate government of Virginia, since Virginia has seceded from the Union. And then that reorganized government authorized a new state with the approval of Lincoln and Congress, and West Virginia became a state on June 20th, 1863. Also Nevada, without a large population, but some population primarily due to silver in the state. So you have 3 new states that take the place a little bit of the seceded states. The South believed that it could get Britain and France to intervene. Britain and France stayed neutral, but there were some overtones. 2 agents for the Confederacy made it to Cuba and then boarded a British ship called Trent. The Trent was captured by a U.S. ship because it had 2 agents for the Confederacy. The United States was later apologized to Britain. And Britain and France did not become heavily involved on the side of the Confederacy. The war had new technology. In 1855, you had a revolver, the Colt revolver, that would be used. In 1860, the Winchester repeating rifle. Both of these weapons allowed for multiple shots without reloading. Hot air balloons were used for surveillance. The North had railroads and the telegraph, which were good, but they also had limits because they didn't go everywhere. You can see most of the battles, the initial battles started in the northern part of the South, and most of the battles were in the South, which was good in some ways for the South, but it also saw more of their property destroyed. The first true battle was in July of 1861, the first battle of Bull Run or Manassas. Depends on whether you get the name from the North or the South. That was a Southern victory. You had some other battles. The Battle of Shiloh was also an early battle. And then a significant battle in April, New Orleans surrendered to the North. So the South had some victories in both Shiloh and Bull Run, but then the North captures, and capturing New Orleans was very important because it cut off a lot of trade for the South. Also, George McClellan, who led the Union armies initially, had troops 25 miles from Richmond, the Southern capital, but he didn't advance. And later, the Second Battle of Bull Run or Manassas in August of 1862 prevented the Union from going to Richmond. And then, even though the Union had a victory in the Battle of Antietam Creek or Sharpsburg, they didn't press forward with it. And Lincoln would fire McClellan. He appointed Ambrose Burnside, but Lincoln found him too timid. Then Joseph Hooker became a leading general, leading the Army of the Potomac, the principal Union Army in 1863. But he was outflanked by Robert E. Lee at the Battle of Chancellorsville. And so Lincoln, throughout the first years of the war, was looking for a general who would do what he wanted. He would find one in the West, and that would be Ulysses S. Grant. He's fighting in the West. In July of 1863, Vicksburg, Mississippi falls after a long siege. Vicksburg, when the Union captures Vicksburg, they've already captured New Orleans, and they control the Mississippi River. It cuts off Louisiana, Arkansas, and Texas from the rest of the Confederacy. About the same time, you have the largest battle of the war, the Battle of Gettysburg. Robert E. Lee, leading Southern troops, wants to go into the North after having a lot of successes in the South. The Battle of Gettysburg is not a success for the South. A third of the army were either killed or wounded or were taken prisoner. So it's a horrible defeat for the South. And Lee and his armies flee south. Later, the Union wins control of the Tennessee River and some other battles. And the war would come down to primarily Ulysses S. Grant versus Robert E. Lee, although there's still some other commanders that are involved. Lincoln promoted Grant to be the commander of all Northern armies because he wasn't timid. Now, he would suffer a lot of casualties, but he would win battles. Under Grant, the Army of the Potomac advances towards the southern capital. Grant had 115,000 men. Lee had only 75,000. And so there's some battles in the middle of 1864, but they're indecisive. Further south, William Tecumseh Sherman doesn't fight battles, but what he does is he marches to the sea. He has 90,000 troops or 60,000 Confederate troops. He doesn't fight a lot of battles. One, Kennesaw Mountain, that he actually loses. But what he does is he destroys Southern property. He burns Atlanta in September of 1864 and then continues to the coast to Savannah, turns north, and goes through South Carolina and North Carolina, burning property, destroying property. And you can see where he goes. He goes from near Chattanooga down through Atlanta to Savannah and then up further. And this really destroys the Southern will to fight. But meanwhile, you have Grant and Lee that are fighting a series of battles in Northern Virginia. Grant takes Petersburg, as you can see here, in a long battle that lasts several months. When that occurs in April of 1865, it leaves the door open to Richmond. And when he takes it, Lincoln actually goes there after the city falls, the war's ending. And Lee's army has been reduced to 25,000. And on April 9th, 1865, Lee surrenders to Grant at the city of Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, and the long war ends. That's all we have for tonight. There'll be an assignment to go with this.